They said Park Joon-Hyuk had never bowed to anyone. Not to elders. Not to rivals. Not even to the men who helped build his empire. In Seoul's underworld, his name was spoken carefully, if at all. Old money. Old rules. Absolute authority. His estate wasn't a home. It was a boundary. Once crossed, nothing left unchanged. Rule number 1 was simple. No outsiders. Ever. That rule broke on a quiet night no one would remember, except the people who were there. A young woman under his employ stood frozen at the edge of the marble hall, her pulse racing louder than her breath. Beside her was her grandmother, Mama Adana Okoye, small in stature, wrapped in simple fabric, her posture calm in a place built to intimidate. The doors closed behind them. Footsteps approached. Measured. Unhurried. Final. Park Joon-Hyuk entered the hall the way storms entered cities, without warning and without apology. His presence shifted the air. Men straightened. Hands moved closer to weapons. Eyes dropped. He saw the stranger immediately. Security reacted first. Metal clicked. Silence sharpened. No one spoke. No one moved. Everyone waited for the order that would end the mistake. The young woman stepped forward instinctively, her voice trembling as she shielded her grandmother. Apologies spilled out too fast to matter. Excuses followed. Fear filled the space where mercy rarely existed. Park Joon-Hyuk raised a hand. The room froze. He stared at the elderly woman, not with anger, not with suspicion, but with something far more dangerous. Recognition. His breath caught. Slowly, deliberately, he removed his coat. Then, to the disbelief of every man who had ever feared him, Park Joon-Hyuk lowered himself to the floor. Not a gesture. Not a courtesy. A bow, deep, formal, absolute. The kind given only to those who hold authority beyond power. No one understood what they were witnessing. No one dared interrupt it. And in that silence, one question settled over the room like a held breath. Who was this grandmother that the king himself would bow? Park Joon-Hyuk ruled, without spectacle. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't repeat himself. He didn't threaten. Threats were for men who needed permission to be feared. Joon-Hyuk never did. His authority lived in the way rooms adjusted when he entered. Conversations shortened. Chairs shifted back half an inch. Men who had killed without hesitation learned to breathe more quietly around him. It wasn't fear exactly, it was alignment. Like iron filings pulled toward something heavier. The estate reflected that gravity. Stone and glass, precise and unwelcoming. No photographs. No softness. Even the air felt measured, cooled to a temperature that discouraged comfort. This was not a place for warmth. It was a place for decisions. Every rule here had been written in consequence. No phones past the second gate. No names spoken unnecessarily. No questions without purpose. And, above all, no strangers. Joon-Hyuk had bowed to no one since childhood, and even then, only once. That memory had been sealed away, buried beneath years of discipline and blood-earned control. Bowing implied debt. Debt implied weakness. Weakness got men buried. Tonight was no different. He stood at the head of the long table, jacket immaculate, expression unreadable, listening as reports came in. Numbers. Timelines. Names that would disappear before sunrise. He processed it all with the same detached precision he brought to everything else. When someone spoke too long, he lifted his eyes. That was enough. The man stopped mid-sentence, throat tightening, understanding immediately where the error had been. Joon-Hyuk dismissed them with a small gesture. Not impatience. Completion. He moved through the hall afterward alone, footsteps steady against marble that had never echoed anyone else's confidence quite the same way. Portraits of ancestors lined the walls. Men who had built fortunes, lost them, rebuilt them harder. Old money respected resilience. Joon-Hyuk had learned early that respect was earned twice, once with success and again with restraint. He paused briefly at the balcony overlooking the city. Seoul stretched endlessly below, alive with lights and movement, and people who believed power lived somewhere else. Politics, corporations, institutions. They were wrong. Power lived here, in silence, in rooms where decisions were made without applause. Behind him, guards stood at attention, invisible until needed, loyal, efficient, replaceable. That was how the world worked. Joon-Hyuk turned back inside, already moving on to the next calculation. Nothing lingered with him. No emotion followed him down the corridor. No memory reached for him uninvited. He was the man who never bowed. Not to tradition. Not to sentiment. Not to anyone still breathing. And if the night had ended as it was supposed to, it would have stayed that way. But somewhere beyond the doors he had just passed, a rule was already breaking. Quietly, irreversibly, making its way toward him on steady feet, wrapped not in threat or ambition, but in calm. And Park Joon-Hyuk, for all his control, did not yet know that his authority was about to be tested by something it had never learned how to command. The rule broke without noise. No alarms. No raised voices. No hurried footsteps. Just a door opening where it never should have. Mama Adana Okoye moved through the service corridor slowly, not because she was unsure, but because haste had never been her language. The marble floor was cold beneath her sandals. The walls rose high and bare, stripped of warmth the way powerful places often were. She took it in with calm eyes, the kind that had seen far worse than luxury meant to intimidate. Behind her, the young woman hovered, hands twisting in the fabric of her sleeves, breath coming too fast. Fear clung to her like smoke. This place knew how to produce it. "Come," Mama Adana said gently, her voice steady. "We will not rush." They passed a threshold marked only by space. No sign, no lock, no warning. Just the sudden widening of the hall, the way sound thinned, the way the air changed. This was not meant for them. Everyone who worked here understood that instinctively. You didn't need to be told where not to step. The house taught you. The young woman felt it then. Her stomach dropped. Her feet slowed. "This is enough," she whispered. "We shouldn't." Mama Adana stopped. She turned, studying the girl's face with quiet patience. Fear had made her small, folded her inward the way the world often did to those it used and ignored. Mama Adana reached out, resting a warm hand over the girl's trembling one. "There are places," she said softly, "that believe they are forbidden because no one has ever entered them with peace." She stepped forward again. The door at the end of the hall stood open, heavywood pulled back as if inviting a mistake. Inside, the room waited. Vast, deliberate, built to remind anyone who entered who held power here. The chair at its center faced away from the door, tall-backed and commanding, positioned so that anyone approaching would have to announce themselves long before they were seen. Mama Adana did not announce herself. She walked in, her cane tapping once against the floor, and paused. The room smelled of leather and restraint, of decisions made late and never questioned. She looked at the chair, then at the city framed by glass beyond it. "So much noise," she murmured, not unkindly, "and yet so much loneliness." She lowered herself into the chair. It fit her as if it had been waiting. Outside the room, the young woman froze, heart hammering, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on her all at once. This wasn't just a rule broken. This was a line crossed that no one crossed and lived to explain. Footsteps sounded in the distance. Measured. Approaching. Mama Adana heard them too. She straightened slightly, smoothing her dress, hands folding in her lap. Her expression remained calm, composed, unafraid. Whatever was coming would find her as she was. And somewhere down the hall, Park Joon-Hyuk was walking toward the one space in his world that had never known interruption, unaware that it had already been claimed by someone who did not recognize power by the size of the room it occupied. Silence arrived first. It settled into the room the moment Park Joon-Hyuk crossed the threshold, heavy and deliberate, pressing down on every breath. The city beyond the glass seemed to mute itself, lights flickering without sound, as if even Seoul knew better than to intrude. He stopped. The chair was occupied, not by an enemy, not by a man who had made a fatal mistake, but by an elderly woman, seated with her hands folded in her lap, gaze lifted calmly toward the window as though she were waiting for someone who had taken too long. For half a second, nothing moved. Then training took over. Metal whispered from holsters. The soft, synchronized sound of safeties disengaging rippled through the room. Reds appeared, steady, precise, settling over Mama Adana's chest, her shoulders, the space just beneath her chin. Every angle covered. Every outcome calculated. The young woman behind her made a sound she couldn't stop, a sharp breath that broke and vanished. She stepped forward without thinking, arms spreading as if her body alone could rewrite what was about to happen. "Please," she said, the word tumbling out too fast. She didn't know.
"I'm sorry."
"I'll take her away."
I'll.
Park Joon-Hyuk raised a hand. The gesture was small. The effect was absolute. No one fired. No one spoke. Guns remained raised, unwavering, but the decision hovered in the air, waiting for him to finish forming it. He took a step closer. Mama Adana turned then, slowly, as if she had simply noticed him. Her eyes met his, not with fear, not with apology, but with quiet attention. The kind given to someone worth listening to. "Well," she said gently, her voice warm in a room built for cold. "There you are." Something tightened behind Joon-Hyuk's ribs. He had faced men who screamed when they realized they were about to die. He had faced silence that begged. He had never faced calm like this. A calm that did not ask for mercy, because it did not believe it was owed harm. His gaze dropped to her hands. They were steady. A guard shifted his weight, barely perceptible, waiting for the signal that would let him breathe again. Another swallowed, throat working around tension that had nowhere to go. This was wrong. Everyone in the room felt it. The script had been broken and no one knew what line came next. The young woman's voice cracked. "Sir, please." Park Joon-Hyuk didn't look at her. He was still watching Mama Adana. Memory stirred. Not fully, not yet, but enough to unsettle the perfect order he carried inside himself. A sound. A cadence. The way she sat, unbowed in a chair that had been designed to humble. The guns remained trained. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, impossibly, Park Joon-Hyuk reached for the buttons of his coat. One by one, he undid them. The guards noticed. Their confusion sharpened, instinct screaming that something fundamental was slipping out of alignment. This was not procedure. This was not protocol. Joon-Hyuk shrugged the coat from his shoulders and let it fall. The sound it made when it hit the floor was soft. Final. And in that suspended moment, before knees touched marble, before breath was released, the world held still, waiting to understand why the man who had never bowed was about to do something no one would ever forget. Park Joon-Hyuk went down slowly. Not the way men fell when they were struck, or forced, or defeated. This was deliberate, measured, as controlled as every other movement he had ever made, until the meaning of it caught up with the room. One knee touched the marble. The sound was quiet, almost polite, but it traveled farther than any gunshot ever could. It reached the guards first. Their breath hitched. Fingers tightened on triggers that no longer knew what they were waiting for. Red dots wavered, then steadied again, uncertain of their purpose. Then the second knee. Park Joon-Hyuk lowered his head. Not briefly. Not symbolically. He bowed deep, spine straight, gaze to the floor, exposing the back of his neck in a way no one alive had ever seen. It was the kind of bow reserved for ancestors, for elders whose authority came before law, for debts that could never be repaid. The room broke, not loudly but internally. Reality bent. The young woman let out a sound somewhere between a sob and disbelief. Her hands flew to her mouth, eyes wide, unable to reconcile the man she feared with the posture he now held. Mama Adana did not move. She watched him with a softness that did not lessen her dignity. Her eyes filled, not with shock, but with recognition long settled, as if she had always known this moment would come when it was ready. "Stand up," she said gently. Park Joon-Hyuk did not. His breath trembled once. Just once. Then he spoke, his voice lower than anyone had ever heard it, roughened by something dangerously close to truth. "I have been looking for you," he said. "Longer than I knew how to count." The words landed unevenly, like stones dropped into still water. No one in the room understood them, but everyone felt their weight. Mama Adana leaned forward slightly, her cane resting against her knee. She studied him the way one studied a child who had grown too hard too fast. "You grew tall," she said, "but you carried heavy." Something fractured behind Joon-Hyuk's ribs. His shoulders shook, not with weakness, but with restraint finally losing the fight. He bowed deeper, forehead nearly touching the floor, as if the marble itself might forgive him for what he had become. The guns lowered, not because of an order but because no one could justify holding them anymore. Silence changed shape. It was no longer sharp. It became reverent. The young woman dropped to her knees without realizing she'd done it, tears streaking down her face. This wasn't mercy. This wasn't madness. This was something older than fear, older than power. Mama Adana reached out then, resting her hand lightly on Park Joon-Hyuk's bowed head. The touch was brief. It was enough. When he finally lifted his face, his eyes were wet, unguarded, stripped of the armor that had taken a lifetime to build. The man who rose from that bow was still dangerous, still powerful. But something essential had shifted. The man who never bowed had remembered who he was. And the room, every stone, every witness, every unspoken rule, understood that it would never return to what it had been before. The memory did not arrive gently. It came the way truth often did, uninvited, sharp-edged, refusing to be ignored. Long before marble halls and measured power, there had been a boy who learned to keep his eyes down and his fists tight. A boy who learned quickly which streets to avoid and which bruises not to complain about. Hunger had been his first teacher. Silence his second. Park Joon-Hyuk had not always been a name spoken with caution. Once, it had been nothing more than something shouted in anger, mispronounced, dismissed. He had been young then. Too young to carry the weight placed on him. Too proud to beg. He remembered the night rain soaked through his thin jacket, remembered counting steps because it distracted him from the cold. He remembered thinking that if he could just keep moving, the world might forget to notice him. It hadn't. Mama Adana had. She had seen him standing outside a closed shop long after night had fallen, pretending not to look inside. She had watched for a moment before speaking, giving him the dignity of choice even then. "You can come in," she'd said. "Or you can keep pretending." But pretending is tiring. Her home had been small, warm in a way he didn't trust at first. She had fed him without asking his name, corrected his posture without raising her voice, listened without interrupting. When he flinched, she had waited. When he lied, she had smiled like she already knew. She did not save him with softness alone. She taught him to stand straight, to speak clearly, to know when silence was strength and when it was fear wearing discipline's face. She taught him that respect was not something you demanded, it was something you practiced, especially when no one was watching. "You do not bow because you are small," she had told him once, tapping his chest lightly. "You bow because you know who you are." He had carried that sentence with him into every room he later conquered, even when he pretended not to hear it anymore. Life had pulled him away eventually. It always did. Circumstance, obligation, violence that came disguised as destiny. He left without understanding what he was losing, convinced that survival required distance. Years hardened him. Power reshaped him. The boy disappeared beneath layers of control and consequence. But Mama Adana had never left him. She lived in the pauses he never allowed himself. In the discipline that outlasted rage. In the instinct to protect rather than destroy, buried so deep he mistook it for strategy. Now, standing before her again, Park Joon-Hyuk felt the full measure of it. He had built an empire with fear. She had built a man with care. The difference was devastating. Mama Adana watched him quietly, as if she had always known he would return this way. Older, heavier, carrying too much. Her eyes softened, not with pity, but with understanding earned over a lifetime. "You did well," she said simply, "even when you forgot why." And in that moment, Park Joon-Hyuk understood something no victory had ever taught him. Kings were not made by the crowns they took. They were shaped by the hands that raised them before they ever reached for power. The shift didn't announce itself. Power never did when it was changing hands. It revealed itself in smaller things first. In the way Park Joon-Hyuk paused before speaking, as if listening for something beyond the room. In the way his guards noticed, he no longer walked 3 steps ahead of everyone else, but beside Mama Adana when she moved through the estate, matching her pace without comment. Orders still came. They were still obeyed. Men still feared him. But the fear had lost its sharpest edge. He began canceling meetings without explanation, redirecting shipments, correcting tone where he once corrected mistakes. When a man stammered through a report, Joon-Hyuk waited instead of cutting him off. When another spoke too boldly, he didn't punish him. He asked why. That unsettled them more than violence ever had. Mama Adana took her meals in the light-filled room overlooking the garden, and Joon-Hyuk joined her whenever he could. He listened more than he spoke. When she corrected him, it was never loudly, never in front of others. A glance, a quiet word, a raised brow that reminded him of who he had been before he learned how to be feared. "You don't need to harden every answer," she told him once, stirring her tea. "Some things are already strong." He didn't argue. The estate felt it. Staff moved with less tension. Guards relaxed their shoulders when she passed. The house, once built to intimidate, began to breathe. And the city noticed. Power was a language spoken fluently in Seoul's underworld, and Joon-Hyuk's dialect had changed. Rivals heard it in the gaps. Meetings that ended without bloodshed, negotiations that settled too cleanly. Rumors spread not of weakness, but of unpredictability. Unpredictable was dangerous. Men who had waited years for a crack leaned forward. Old enemies watched more closely. New ones took notes. A man in a quiet bar studied a photograph passed across the table. It showed Park Joon-Hyuk standing beside an elderly woman, his posture subtly altered, his attention unmistakably fixed on her. "That's not a shield," the man murmured. "That's an anchor." Anchors could be pulled. Back at the estate, Joon-Hyuk stood alone on the balcony again. The city stretched out beneath him as it always had. But this time, he did not feel above it. He felt responsible to it in a way that had nothing to do with ownership. Mama Adana's words echoed in him, settling where strategy usually lived. Power was not disappearing. It was changing shape. And Park Joon-Hyuk knew, deep in the place where instinct ruled, that whatever came next would test him more than any war he had survived. Because it was easier to rule through fear. It was far more dangerous to rule with something to lose. The warning did not come as an attack. It arrived as observation. A black sedan appeared at the edge of the estate one morning and did not move. It returned the next day, parked half a block farther down, angled just enough to watch without seeming to. Different driver. Same patience. Joon-Hyuk noticed it before anyone told him. He always did. He said nothing at first. Silence had always been his first response to challenge. But this silence felt different. Measured not to intimidate, but to understand. He watched the sedan through the balcony glass, Mama Adana beside him, her hands folded around a warm cup of tea. "Someone is counting," she said calmly, as if commenting on the weather. "Yes," he replied. "They always do." The city began to shift around them. Information arrived too easily. Rumors surfaced where there had been none. Men who once avoided his name began to ask questions that lingered a second too long. Who was the woman? Why was she here? Why did the devil walk slower now? Respect had created a shape in his life that fear never had. And shapes cast shadows. The first message came disguised as courtesy, a business proposal from a rival syndicate that had kept its distance for years. The terms were generous. Too generous. Hidden inside them was an expectation. Access. Joon-Hyuk declined. The second message was less subtle. A delivery truck stalled near the outer gate, engine smoking, blocking traffic just long enough to prove it could. No damage. No confrontation. Just a reminder of proximity. Mama Adana watched him that evening as he paced the study, tension pulling tight across his shoulders. "They are testing the edges," she said. "Yes," he answered. "To see where I will bend." "And will you?" He stopped. For years, the answer would have been simple. He would have broken them first. Loudly. Permanently. He had built his legend on answers like that. But now, bending meant something else. "They think you are leverage," he said quietly. Mama Adana met his gaze, without flinching. "Then they do not understand what they are touching." That was the problem. Others would. The third message came without disguise. A man Joon-Hyuk had exiled years ago was found dead in a district that fell squarely under his protection. The kill was clean, efficient, signed in a way only insiders would recognize. A provocation. Fear stirred through the ranks. Guards tightened formations. Advisors whispered contingency plans that ended in blood. Joon-Hyuk felt it then, the full weight of what had changed. As long as he stood alone, the world only tested his strength. Now it was measuring his attachments. He looked at Mama Adana, seated calmly in a room that had once been forbidden to her, and understood the truth no enemy needed to say out loud. Respect had given him something worth protecting. And the moment power gains a heart, the world starts looking for where to strike. The night made its move without ceremony. It began with glass. A sharp, explosive sound tore through the outer wing of the estate, followed by a second impact that rattled the walls and sent birds screaming into the sky. Alarms screamed to life a heartbeat too late. Men shouted. Footsteps thundered. Joon-Hyuk was already moving. He crossed the corridor in long, controlled strides, coat forgotten, weapon in hand, not with the cold anticipation of battle, but with something tighter, more focused. Protection sharpened instinct differently than domination ever had. Mama Adana stood in the doorway of the sitting room, cane in hand, eyes clear. "They're here," she said. "Yes," he replied. "And they will not reach you." Gunfire cracked through the night. Return fire answered it, disciplined and fast. Joon-Hyuk positioned himself between the noise and the room behind him without thinking. This was not strategy. This was reflex. A guard fell near the stairs. Another dragged him clear. The enemy was coordinated, deliberate, testing defenses, pushing inward, searching for a reaction that would confirm what they believed. That fear had softened him. A voice echoed from outside, amplified, calm enough to be insulting. An offer. Safe passage. An exchange framed as reason. Joon-Hyuk felt the old answer rise in him. Swift, violent, final. He could end this the way he always had. Send a message, so loud the city would go quiet again. The path was familiar. Easy. Mama Adana stepped closer. "You are deciding," she said gently. He didn't deny it. "They will keep coming," he said. "As long as they believe you make me hesitate." She studied his face, seeing past the armor to the man choosing what kind of power would survive this night. "Then teach them what you protect," she said. "Not what you destroy." The word settled. Joon-Hyuk closed his eyes once. Just once. When he opened them, the decision was complete. He gave a series of quiet commands into his calm. Precise, unexpected. Defensive lines shifted. Routes changed. The estate opened where it had always closed, funneling attackers into controlled spaces. Not a massacre. A containment. Minutes stretched. Shots slowed. Panic replaced confidence. When it was over, the night fell quiet again, not because fear had crushed it, but because resistance had nowhere left to stand. Joon-Hyuk stood in the courtyard as captives were secured, alive and shaken. The message would travel faster this way. He turned back toward the house. Mama Adana waited where she always did, unharmed, unbroken, watching him with eyes that measured not victory, but choice. "You chose well," she said. He exhaled, something easing in his chest that no amount of bloodshed had ever relieved. Violence would always answer him if he called. But tonight, he had chosen protection. And the city would learn that the man who bowed had not grown weaker. He had become far more dangerous to those who misunderstood what strength truly was. Morning arrived without apology. The estate stood intact, stone washed clean by rain that fell through the last hours of darkness. Broken glass had been cleared. Blood had been erased. To anyone passing the gates, nothing suggested the night had tested its walls. Inside, everything had changed. Park Joon-Hyuk stood in the garden as light settled over the leaves, his jacket folded neatly on a chair he no longer needed to command. Guards remained at their posts, but their presence felt different now, protective rather than oppressive, alert without being tense. Mama Adana walked beside him, her steps unhurried, her cane tapping softly against the path. She paused to examine a rose bush that had survived the chaos untouched, fingers brushing a petal with quiet approval. "Things that are rooted," she said, "do not fear storms." Joon-Hyuk nodded. The city responded quickly. Messages came in, not challenges, not threats, but recalibrations. Men who had tested his edges withdrew. Others offered apologies framed as misunderstandings. Word traveled the way it always did in places like this, but the story it carried was different now. He had not slaughtered his enemies. He had spared them, and that unsettled the world more deeply than fear ever had. Later, in the hall that once tolerated no interruption, Joon-Hyuk gathered his inner circle. He spoke without elevation, without distance. His words were precise, his expectations unchanged, but the center of gravity had shifted. "This house is no longer ruled by silence alone," he said. "It will be ruled by restraint. Those who cannot live with that may leave now." No one moved. They understood what kind of power this was. It was harder to challenge, harder to predict, harder to break. When the room cleared, Joon-Hyuk returned to the sitting room where Mama Adana waited, sunlight warming the floor at her feet. He stopped a few steps away, instinctively, then caught himself. He knelt, not because he needed to be seen doing it, not because anyone demanded it, but because it was the truest expression left to him. Mama Adana placed her hand on his shoulder, firm and steady. "You have learned," she said, "that power does not disappear when you lower yourself." He looked up at her, eyes clear. "It becomes something worth carrying." The man who rose was still dangerous, still decisive, still capable of ending lives if forced to. But he was no longer ruled by fear of loss. Park Joon-Hyuk had bowed once more, not to weakness, not to the past, but to the future he chose to protect. And the city, watching from a distance, understood at last. This was not the fall of a king. It was the arrival of a different kind of power,